There are companies that become famous because their names are written across the front of a product. Perkins was different. For most people, the name was hidden. It sat beneath a bonnet, behind a panel under a deck, inside a generator housing, or buried deep in the frame of a working machine. You did not always see it. But if you worked on farms, boats, vans, construction sites, warehouses, or remote power units, there was a good chance you heard it. A Perkins engine did not need glamour. It was not built to impress a crowd. It was built to start in the cold, pull under load, run for long hours, and keep going after the paint around it had faded. That was its promise. For much of the 20th century, Perkins engines powered the ordinary machinery that made ordinary life possible. They helped farmers harvest fields, helped hauliers move goods, helped builders lift and dig, helped fishermen work at sea, and helped small workshops and industries keep machines running. The company did not sell fantasy. It sold dependability, and at the center of that story was Peterborough. For decades, the Perkins Works was not just a place where engines were assembled. It was part of the rhythm of the city. Families had someone who worked there. Young men entered as apprentices. Shift times shaped traffic. Wages from the factory moved through shops, homes, pubs, and neighborhoods. The company's success was not only measured in engines shipped. It was measured in skilled hands, steady work, and a city that knew its name meant something beyond its own streets. But Perkins is not a simple story of a factory that rose and then vanished. That would be easier to tell. The name did not disappear. The badge was not erased from history. Perkins engines continued to be made. Peterborough remained part of the company's identity. In one sense, Perkins survived, but in another sense, something essential was lost. The independent British engine maker that had once helped change the future of diesel power became part of a much larger global industrial system. The name remained, but the center of control changed. The company survived, but not in the same form. Its story became one of the most complicated kinds of industrial change. Not death, but transformation. So the real question is not simply, why did Perkins close? Because that is not the right question. The deeper question is this: how did a company that once helped put diesel power into the working machines of the world become a brand inside someone else's empire? The answer begins in 1932, in a much smaller world. At the time, diesel engines had a problem. They were useful, economical, and respected, but they were also seen as heavy, slow, and better suited to large industrial work. Diesel belonged to ships, factories, stationary plant, and heavy machinery. Petrol engines were associated with speed, cars, lorries, and the modern road. Frank Perkins believed that could change. He did not invent diesel. That was not the point. His idea was different. He believed diesel could be made lighter, quicker, and practical enough for vehicles and smaller working machines. He saw that the future would not only belong to engines that were powerful. It would belong to engines that were economical, compact, and useful in many different settings. That vision needed more than confidence. It needed engineering. Beside Perkins was Charles Chapman, the technical mind who helped turn the idea into metal. Together, they formed a partnership that would define the company's early character. Perkins had the commercial instinct. Chapman had the engineering discipline. One understood how to persuade a market. The other understood how to make the machine work. They began in Peterborough, in a modest office on Queen Street. There was nothing inevitable about their success. New engineering firms are rarely born with stability. They begin with risk, borrowed time, technical setbacks, and the constant pressure to find customers before the money runs out. But Perkins had a sharp idea. The company did not need to build the whole vehicle. It could become the power inside other people's machines. That decision shaped everything. Perkins was not trying to be a tractor company, a truck company, or a boat builder. It wanted to become the engine supplier trusted by all of them. That gave the company flexibility from the beginning. It could sell into road transport, farming, marine work, construction, power generation, and industrial equipment. It could serve many markets without being trapped inside one. The early engines carried animal names, Vixen, Wolf, and others, that made the machines feel almost alive. But beneath the names was a serious argument. These engines were evidence that diesel did not have to remain slow and awkward. Diesel could become mobile. Diesel could fit into the working world of roads, fields, yards, and small machines. One of the most important things Perkins did was change the image of diesel itself. The company helped move diesel away from the idea of heavy, static power and toward the idea of practical movement. At Brooklands, where speed and modern machinery carried symbolic weight, Perkins diesel engines set records. That mattered not only as publicity, but as proof. Diesel could run. Diesel could compete. Diesel could be more than the slow workhorse of industry. But a factory is not built on one demonstration. A factory is built when an idea becomes repeatable. The engine has to work not once, but thousands of times. The parts have to be measured, machined, checked, assembled, tested, and delivered. A customer who buys a working engine is not buying a theory. He is buying trust. He is buying the belief that when the key turns, the machine will answer. By the late 1930s, Perkins had begun to establish that trust. Engines such as the P4 and P6 helped move the company from experiment to serious manufacturer. These were not glamorous objects. They were practical pieces of engineering at a time when practical engineering mattered deeply. Then came war. The Second World War placed enormous pressure on British industry. Factories were expected to produce not for comfort or prestige, but for national need. Engines, vehicles, equipment, and power units became part of a much larger system of survival. Perkins did not become important because of the war alone, but the war reinforced the value of dependable production. After the war, the need changed, but did not disappear. Britain had to rebuild. Farms had to modernize. Goods had to move. Local authorities, contractors, farmers, and manufacturers needed machines that could work hard while keeping costs under control. Diesel made sense because it offered economy and durability. For commercial users, that mattered more than elegance. A farmer did not judge an engine the way a sports car driver did. A farmer judged it by whether it would start before dawn, pull through wet soil, and keep going when weather left no time for breakdowns. A haulier judged it by fuel costs, reliability, and repairability. A mechanic judged it by whether parts could be found and whether the design made sense under spanners. This was exactly the world Perkins was built to serve. In 1947, the company moved production to Eastfield in Peterborough. This was one of the great turning points in the Perkins story. Eastfield was not just a new site. It was the physical expression of the company's growth. There were assembly lines, test beds, stores, offices, machine shops, and the constant movement of parts and people. Engines arrived as castings, components, and drawings. They left as finished power units ready to be fitted into someone else's working machine. A place like Eastfield changes the city around it. It gives people a reason to stay. It gives young workers a route into a trade. It creates pride but also dependence. The factory becomes part of local memory. People do not remember it only as a building. They remember the noise, the smell, the buses, the shift patterns, the canteen, the pay packet, the men and women who walked through the gates each day. Perkins became part of Peterborough's identity because it offered more than employment. It offered belonging. At the same time, Perkins was never only a local company. Its engines traveled much farther than the city that made them. They went into tractors, trucks, boats, generators, compressors, and industrial machines across different countries and industries. That was the quiet brilliance of the business model. The company could remain rooted in Peterborough while its engines worked around the world. And one of the most important worlds Perkins entered was agriculture. The 20th century changed, farming more dramatically than almost any earlier period. Horses gave way to tractors. Manual labor gave way to mechanization. Fields that once depended on muscle, weather, and animal strength became places of engines, fuel, hydraulics, and steel. For farmers, the tractor was not simply a machine. It was time. It was control. It was the ability to plow, sow, harvest, and move before the weather turned. The engine inside it was the heart of that promise. Perkins understood this world. Frank Perkins himself came from an agricultural engineering background, and the company's engines suited farming perfectly. They were economical. They had useful torque. They were durable. They could be maintained by people who expected machinery to be worked, repaired, and worked again. This made the relationship with Massey Ferguson especially important. Massey Ferguson was one of the great names in agricultural machinery. Perkins became closely connected to the power behind those machines. In 1959, Massey Ferguson bought Perkins. On paper, this could have been the beginning of the Perkins name fading into a larger agricultural business. But that did not happen. The Perkins identity remained strong. The company continued to build its reputation, and the connection with Massey Ferguson gave it access to a wider global machinery system. For a time, this arrangement strengthened Perkins rather than weakening it. The company could serve Massey Ferguson while continuing to supply other customers and markets. The result was a powerful combination, a respected engine maker, tied to one of the world's major agricultural machinery names, but still recognizable in its own right. The 1960s showed what Perkins did best. Engines like the 6.354 became central to the company's reputation. The genius of such engines was not that they belonged to one famous machine. It was that they could belong to many. They could be adapted into trucks, tractors, industrial equipment, marine applications, and machines far beyond Britain. That kind of versatility is easy to underestimate. A consumer brand becomes famous by being visible. Perkins became important by being useful. The same was true of engines such as the 4.108 and 4.236. These were not names that meant much to the casual public, but to operators, mechanics, farmers, boat owners, and equipment builders they carried weight. They were known because they worked. They were known because parts existed. They were known because people had experience with them. That kind of reputation is built slowly. It is built every time an engine starts in poor weather. It is built every time a machine finishes a job. It is built every time a mechanic can repair something instead of writing it off. Perkins did not become trusted because of a slogan. It became trusted because thousands of working people found that the engines did what they were supposed to do. This trust became one of the company's greatest assets. But industrial trust can also hide a danger. A company can be loved by its users and still be vulnerable to changes beyond its control. It can make respected products and still face a market that becomes too large, too expensive, and too complex for its old structure. By the 1970s and 1980s, the world around Perkins was changing. Diesel engines were no longer a young technology fighting for acceptance. They had become central to agriculture, construction, transport, power generation, and industry. But that maturity brought new pressures. Customers became larger. Regulations became tougher. Competitors became more global. Engines had to be cleaner, quieter, more efficient, and compliant across different markets. The challenge was no longer simply to make a diesel engine that could work. The challenge was to make engines that could satisfy emissions rules, meet global customer demands, integrate with increasingly sophisticated machinery, and justify huge development costs. That changed the economics of the industry. In the early Perkins years, a determined team with a clear technical idea could disrupt assumptions. By the late 20th century, the engine business required enormous research budgets, global manufacturing coordination, electronics, compliance engineering, supply chain strength, and the ability to spread costs across very large volumes. The very thing Perkins had helped prove, that diesel could become practical everywhere, had turned diesel engines into a global battlefield. And in that battlefield, independence became harder to defend. The language of the industry changed too. The older world had spoken in terms of apprenticeships, skilled work, product reputation, and customer loyalty. The newer world spoke about consolidation, efficiency, platforms, emissions strategy, shareholder value, and global capacity. For workers and local communities, that language could feel cold. It took something human, as a factory, a trade, a name, a city, and translated it into corporate terms. Perkins moved through this changing world under a series of owners. After Massey Ferguson came the wider Verity structure. Then Lucas Verity became part of the chain. Through these years, Perkins remained valuable. That is important. The company was not simply collapsing because nobody wanted its engines. It still had engineering skill, customers, facilities, and a respected name. But being valuable can make a company vulnerable in a different way. Sometimes industrial decline begins when a company is no longer wanted. Other times, it begins when a company is wanted by someone much bigger. By the 1990s, This was the position Perkins found itself in. Diesel engine manufacturing had become deeply strategic. Engine makers needed global reach, broad product ranges, and the ability to respond to increasingly strict regulation. Agriculture, construction, materials handling, marine, and power generation customers all demanded engines that were not only reliable, but specialized and compliant. Caterpillar understood the value of Perkins. Caterpillar was already one of the most powerful names in heavy equipment and diesel power. Perkins offered something highly attractive: strength in smaller and medium-sized engines, a strong customer base, a respected engineering tradition, and a position in markets that complemented Caterpillar's own. In 1998, Caterpillar acquired Perkins from Lucas Verity. For Caterpillar, the logic was clear. This was a strategic acquisition. Perkins gave the company more reach, more capability, and a stronger position in the global engine market. It was not an emotional decision. It was industrial strategy, but for people connected to Perkins, the meaning was more complicated. The company had already been owned by others, but Caterpillar was different. This was not just another reshuffle inside British industry. It was the absorption of a British engine name into one of the world's largest machinery companies. The Perkins badge survived. But survival is not always the same as independence. Under Caterpillar, Perkins gained access to greater resources, wider distribution, stronger global systems, and broader technical capacity. Peterborough remained important. Engines continued to be designed, developed, tested, and produced under the Perkins name. In that sense, the story was not one of simple destruction, but the center of gravity changed. The old Perkins had been a company with its own identity, its own roots, its own decisions, and its own relationship with Peterborough. The new Perkins became part of a much larger global structure. It still mattered, but it mattered inside a system it no longer controlled. This is one of the most difficult forms of industrial loss to describe. There is no single day when everything disappears. No dramatic final silence. No empty factory yard with weeds growing through every crack. The work continues. The badge remains. The engines are still real, but something changes underneath. A company becomes a brand. A factory becomes a site. A workforce becomes a unit of capacity. A city becomes one point on a global map. That is not the same as closure, but it is not the same as the old life either. The visible signs came gradually. In 2002, the Shrewsbury engine plant associated with Perkins was phased out, with hundreds of jobs lost and some work shifted elsewhere. For corporate planners, this could be described in terms of capacity, efficiency, and rationalization, but from the ground it meant something simpler and harsher. It meant people leaving jobs they had expected to keep. It meant skills no longer needed in the same place. It meant a factory that had once sounded alive becoming quieter. Industrial language often softens these moments. It says production was transferred. It says operations were consolidated. It says capacity was adjusted. But workers do not live inside those words. They live inside mortgages, routines, family plans, pride, and uncertainty. A lost job is not an abstract adjustment. It is a change in the shape of a life. Peterborough did not suffer the complete disappearance that other industrial towns experienced. Perkins remained present there. That matters. The city did not lose the name entirely. It did not become only a memory, but the relationship between the company and the place had changed. Once Perkins felt like Peterborough speaking to the world through engines. After Caterpillar, Peterborough became part of a much larger industrial network. The work still mattered, but the future was no longer shaped in the same local way. That is why Perkins is not a simple story of failure. It is a story of survival with a cost. The company survived because its name still carried value. Its engines still mattered. Its engineering knowledge still mattered. Peterborough's accumulated skill still mattered. The brand remained useful because generations of workers had built credibility into it. But to survive in the modern engine industry, Perkins had to become part of something larger than itself. That was the trade. The deeper causes were layered. There was ownership change. There was consolidation. There was the growing cost of engine development. There were tougher emissions regulations. There was globalization. There were larger customers demanding integrated power solutions. There was the rise of multinational industrial groups with the capital to compete across continents, and beneath all of that was a broader British industrial problem, the difficulty of keeping independent manufacturing champions rooted in local places while competing in markets increasingly shaped by global capital. Perkins was not weak in the way people sometimes imagine. Declining companies to be weak, it was not a useless relic making products nobody wanted. Its very strength made it strategically valuable. Its reputation, customers, and engineering culture made it worth acquiring. But strength in one era does not guarantee control in the next. In the early years, Perkins had won an argument. It had shown that diesel could be faster, lighter, more practical, and more widely useful than many people believed. By the late 20th century, that argument had already been won. Diesel was everywhere. The new argument was different. Who could afford to develop the next generation? Who could meet global regulations? Who could supply global customers? Who could integrate engines into modern machinery systems? Who could carry the cost of technology, compliance, electronics, testing, and production at scale? That was a much harder battlefield for an independent manufacturer. And this is where the emotional heart of the Perkins story lies. The company did not vanish because its engines had no value. It changed because value itself had become something larger corporations wanted to control. Engineering skill became an asset. A trusted name became a brand. A local industrial tradition became part of a global portfolio. There is no need to invent a villain to make the story meaningful. Caterpillar acted like a global corporation. Lucas Verity sold a valuable business. Massey, Ferguson, and Verity had their own financial and structural pressures. Regulators demanded cleaner engines. Customers demanded better performance. Competitors grew larger. Markets changed. The tragedy, if there is one, is not that one bad decision destroyed Perkins. It is that the world in which Perkins had become great no longer existed in the same form. That older world can still be heard in old machines. Listen to an old Perkins engine in a tractor, a boat, a generator, or a van. The sound is not refined. It is mechanical, uneven, and physical. It belongs to a time when engines were more repairable, more understandable, and more directly connected to the people who used them. The cold start, the vibration through the bonnet, the smell of diesel, the mechanic leaning over with tools, the farmer listening for a familiar rhythm before beginning the day. These details matter because Perkins was never only about corporate ownership. It was about a particular kind of trust between machine and worker. For many people, a Perkins engine was not history. It was something they depended on. That is why the story still carries weight. Perkins helped make diesel power practical for the working world. It took a technology that had seemed heavy and limited and helped make it mobile, useful, and trusted across industries. It powered machines that did not always appear in headlines, but quietly shaped the modern economy. It mattered because it worked. And then the world that depended on such engines became too complex for the old independent model. Regulation tightened. Capital requirements grew. Customers globalized. Ownership shifted. The scale of the industry changed. Perkins adapted. But adaptation came at the price of independence. That is the difficult truth at the center of this story. The company survived in one sense and disappeared in another. The name survived. The engine survived. The Peterborough connection survived. But the old independent Perkins, the company that grew from a small office, a radical idea, and a city's engineering culture, was folded into something much larger, and perhaps that is why Perkins remains such a powerful industrial story. It asks us what survival really means. Is a company alive if the badge remains? Is it alive if the factory still works? Is it alive if skilled people still build engines under the same name? Or does something disappear when the decisions, ownership, and future of that company move beyond the place that gave it life? There is no simple answer. Perkins did not end with a single locked gate. It did not become only a ruin or a faded sign on a brick wall. Its story is more subtle than that, and maybe more modern. It is the story of an industrial name that endured by becoming part of a larger machine. The engines kept turning. The badge kept its meaning. But the world beneath the badge had changed, And somewhere in that change is the story of British manufacturing itself, inventive, skilled, practical, respected, and often unable to remain independent once the scale of the world grew beyond the scale of the factory. Perkins began with a belief that diesel could do more. It proved that belief in metal, in workshops, in fields, in yards, in boats, and in machines that worked for decades. Its legacy is not only in company records or corporate timelines. It is in the engines that still sit under old bonnets waiting to be started again. Its rise was built on usefulness. Its reputation was built on trust. Its transformation was written through ownership, and its sound still echoes wherever old working machines keep moving, long after the world that made them has changed.